Let us pray. At the beginning of this week, we ask you, Father, to renew and strengthen in us the awareness of our duty and privilege as members of this legislature. We ask you also, in your divine providence, to bless and protect the Assembly and the province we are elected to serve. Amen.
Introduction of visitors. Presenting petitions. Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills. Tabling returns and reports.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to table the annual report of the Alberta Water Resources Commission.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to file the terms of reference for the joint consultation committee between Alberta Social Services and the 6th Division of the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees.
Speaker, I'd like to table the annual report of Athabasca University for 84-85.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to file, on behalf of the Alberta Alcohol and Drug Abuse Commission, copies of a brochure regarding methyl hydrate and copies of posters that have been developed about methyl hydrate. These will be widely distributed throughout Alberta and will be delivered to each MLA sometime in the next 2 days.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to file with the Legislative Assembly 4 copies of manifests covering Executive Council travel for the calendar year 1985.
Introduction of special guests. Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct the first question to the Minister of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. Speaker, last Tuesday I asked the Minister if Alberta had been consulted about U.S. heavy bomber flights over this province, and he told me that, like he had read about it in the Calgary Herald. My question is, was that the first time the Minister had heard about these particular tests?
Mr. Speaker, as it transpires, these tests are part of the global testing which takes place within the scope of the NATO agreement and the NORAD agreement between Canada, the United States, and its other allies, and was not, in fact, a special test which had been the gist of the news story which I had read shortly before entering the Assembly. In fact, the overall global agreement had, of course, been communicated to me some time ago, and this was just another of a series of tests which take place on a regular basis. So, in fact, it had been made known to the Department of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs. In addition, as part of the normal reporting process, the Department of the Environment had been consulted some months ago relative to this particular test as a matter of course, as a matter of the agreement and understanding between the Government of Canada and the Government of Alberta.
Bill. Supplementary question then, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister. Is the Minister saying that these weren't special extra besides what we had agreed to with NORAD and NATO? Am I led to believe this is part of an overall program?
That is correct. There are what they call global testing procedures which take place in Canada as part of the regular defense agreements between Canada and the United States. In this particular case, the What was called for were the involvement of 25 aircraft, five at a time over a period of 5 days, which the U.S. bombers would be the objects of search by defense aircraft on the part of the NATO and NORAD exercise.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker. I believe that you'll find that this was an extra request that was different. I have a letter that was delivered to Mr. Jim Fulton, a member of Parliament from Eric Nelson, and he says in there clearly in late 1985, as a result of the Norwood Initiative, SAC headquarters established the establishment of 2 additional low-level training routes. My question, though, to the minister, when we raised this on Tuesday, my question is, why did the minister then not tell us about this active involvement of the Alberta government in designing the bomber flight path on Tuesday when I asked him about consultation?
Mr. Speaker, at the time the question was posed, I did not have possession of all the documentation that had been made available to the Department of the Environment. And furthermore, because the final decision had not been arrived at relative to the test taking place. In fact, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition is no doubt now aware that environmental impact studies had been requested as a result of the proposal, and therefore the matter had not been finally decided upon relative to the timing of the event. I should advise members of the Assembly that the Department of National Defense have been very careful to advise the Department of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs of the date and timing and corridors, etc., relative to testing of various flying objects over Alberta. And I assured the honourable member, as he will recall, that I anticipated that that type of consultation would also take place when a final date had been decided upon by the Department of National Defense pursuant to its obligations under the treaties that it has entered into.
Well, supplementary question. I'm not sure when we're dealing with these matters which minister to ask with. I would understand it would be this minister, but it says, Mr. Speaker, that people from SAC headquarters and National Defense headquarters met with Alberta and British Columbia environmental officials, and that happened in December 1985. My question is this: surely this minister should have been aware of that, and when I asked the question, we should have been brought up to matter. My question is, what will the minister now do to get on top of these matters so that we can ask intelligent questions in this legislature and get some answers?
Intelligent questions help, Mr. Speaker. And I would advise the Honourable Leader of the Opposition that I said in my answer last week that when matters had been decided upon as to the date and time of such events, that of course the Department of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs would be thoroughly briefed on what was being proposed. That was part of my answer at the time.
Supplementary, member for West Loch Sturgeon.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, further to his comments about flying objects over Alberta and being well informed, has he got a complete report now on what happened to the cruise missile accidents in Alberta? Would he be prepared to make that public?
Mr. Speaker, that is a matter that took place some time ago. The Department of National Defense held a briefing, which was a public briefing, following that last event, and I will undertake for the Honourable Member for West Loch Sturgeon to have the same information which was made available by the Department of National Defense at that time to him and to other members of the Assembly.
Second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct the second question to the Premier, and it flows from remarks he made during his estimates on Thursday. Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to quote and come back to this particular quote. He says, "I think industry is being unrealistic to continue to ask for massive royalty cuts." And it goes on to say, if we did merely reduce our royalties and additional activity result, what would we have gained? And they might well have paid off their bankers or large companies will have used the money to buy smaller companies without providing either additional exploration or jobs. That's on page 9. My question flowing from that, agreeing with the Premier's statement on that, but given the Premier's understanding of why massive royalty cuts don't seem to work, the government must have done an analysis of previous royalty cuts, for example, the $550 million in June of 1985. Does the government then have an estimate of how many jobs were created, or for that matter saved, because of that announcement?
I think it's a matter of record, Mr. Speaker, that once the Western Accord was signed, the industry immediately responded and were able to put on quite a active drilling campaign, and we're able to drill some 12,000. I better not estimate the numbers, Mr. Speaker, but in any event, we had during late 1985 and early 1986 one of the most active drilling programs that we've had in some time.
Supplementary question. So the Premier is saying then that there is no idea of how much was created by our royalty cuts in. We don't have that analysis.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when you're dealing in the private sector and with a risk-reward industry like the energy industry, which is the way we like to have it, individuals and companies make all kinds of decisions which will result in jobs and yet efficiencies and a variety of private sector decisions. We believe that in putting the incentives there, and when you have the right balance of incentives for a industry, I think you get the right reaction. In this case, a great deal of activity, and obviously lots of jobs were provided. But I think it'd be unrealistic to try and make a particular estimate of the numbers of jobs.
Supplementary question, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier. In view of the Premier's statements on Thursday night, we did have a $500 million annual cut in '85, and that was followed by a $5.4 billion in cuts between 1982 and '85. Now, has the Premier any evidence at all, then, that these, what I would consider massive giveaways, were not a major waste of public money, which benefited only large companies and not the provincial economy? Do we have any evidence at all that this money wasn't wasted?
Yes, and the evidence, as I just described to the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker, is that before the energy prices turned down, and with the conditions which I described of removing most of the negative impact of the NEP and lowering the province's royalties in a balancing way to provide the right number of incentives. It wasn't a massive giveaway. It was, in fact, the provision of incentives, the balancing of the sharing of energy revenues. And it's always a balance, and it's a judgment you make, that the owners, the people of Alberta, take a certain share, and that industry takes a certain share. And if you get the balance in the right level, you will find that both sides win in the long run. Industry is very active. They're able to make profits, and the people of Alberta, through their government, enjoy a high level of activity, high level of royalties, land sales, exploration, seismic work, development drilling, and I'm sure that in this case, all of those things happened.
Well, supplementary question. It'd be nice to, more than I think, we were trying to get some evidence. My question is, the Premier also confirmed that many of the smaller companies don't pay royalties at all, and that's what we were, at this particular time, that's what we were talking about. But I also remind, as the Premier is well aware, they don't pay PGRT either. and the government admits they aren't taking up drilling incentives. My question is this: has the Premier, at the very least, commissioned a study of how a nationally negotiated floor price could be of some actual help to the smaller companies?
Mr. Speaker, it's not something that we would be doing a study on. We're working on certain options that we think are options that are more favorable. I discussed them in the legislature during my estimates, and should remind the honourable member when he talks about small companies are trying to become big companies, and they might well move out of the area in which they now are of not paying royalties or PGRT into an area where they would. And we want to always try and balance the incentives, Mr. Speaker, so that they will constantly try to grow and develop. I think that's the real art with your royalty system. Make sure that you hit that balance of the right amount of incentives to the industry so that they will take the risks. And that's the important part. Take the risks and explore and develop these reserves, and yet make sure that the people of Alberta who are selling a non-renewable resource, which will be gone forever, also get an adequate return for that resource.
Member for Westlock Sturgeon, supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, having trouble understanding his claim that reduced royalties accounted for the large amount of drilling early in this year, when every recognized authority has said that the large amount of drilling was due to the fact that the national energy policy was expiring at the end of March, and their grant of 30% off for drilling was causing extra drilling, and that the royalty cut that he put in was a throwing away the money. How can he justify that?
No, Mr. Speaker, he's not right. It was a move by the federal and provincial governments, both, in signing the Western Energy Accord that I believe resulted in the high level of activity, and that it was not dollars thrown away at all, and that when those moves were made, we had a very healthy, strong, expanding energy industry. And it was the drop in prices which has slowed that down again. However, we hope, Mr. Speaker, that with helping the industry through this short-term period of adversity, trying to assist them in every way possible, and trying to have the PGRT removed, which is so important, Mr. Speaker, and it's kind of nice to know now that we have the support of the Liberal Party to removing the PGRT, and it was nice to hear in my estimates the other night that we have now the support of the NDP, because Mr. Speaker, it's nice that they have reversed themselves and joined us, because the one consistent position with the PGRT was this government and the Conservative Party wanting to remove it, and we welcome the new support from both parties.
Supplementary, I believe, member for Calgary-McCall. Is that correct?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a supplementary to the Honourable Premier. Could the Premier indicate if the PGR tax and other energy-related matters will be on the agenda when the Government Caucus meets the Alberta Federal Caucus on Thursday of this week?
Mr. Speaker, I would think the agenda will provide lots of opportunity for a discussion of the cooperation between the provincial party and the federal government, the provincial government and the federal government, and discussion of the economy, and two very key matters, the energy and the PGRT tax, which the honourable member has raised, and it will be discussed, as well all the areas in agriculture where we feel Alberta needs further federal assistance. So at that meeting of the Alberta MLAs and the Alberta MPs, there would certainly be that matter discussed and on the agenda.
Main question, Leader of the Liberal Party.
Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, with some regret that I'd lost my title as the best joke teller in the House after that last question. But in view of the... Sounds like feeding time at the zoo over there, but in view of the Premier's statement of cutting off some gas exports, if prices fall too far, and bearing in mind that cutting off some buyers and not others is contrary to the Constitution, is the Premier considering a system of pro-rationing whereby presently reduced gas and oil markets would be shared equally amongst all the producers?
Might say, Mr. Speaker, in the matter of jokes, the honourable member from Westlock Sturgeon has certainly provided some. I didn't know, Mr. Speaker, that he had given himself the title of the best joke teller, because over here we haven't. In the area of in the area of gas removal permits, Mr. Speaker, we certainly have to fulfill our responsibility, as I said earlier, that is given to us under the legislation, to make sure that our resources are not sold at a wastefully low price. And so we will have to continue to do that. I don't know whether the honourable leader, or the honourable member for Westlock Sturgeon is arguing that we should default on that responsibility and sell the resource below fair prices. If it is, I'd like to hear him state that. I think following the events of the weekend that one of his colleagues has said we absolutely should sell at fair prices, and I'm glad to have him on side as well.
And Mr. Speaker, supplementary. It's one difference between his party and mine. We tell jokes, you elect them. But if the Premier aware, is the Premier aware that in the 60s and 70s, when there were similar world surpluses of oil, that Alberta used pro-rationing to keep prices up and to share markets equally? In other words, I think I'm making a constructive suggestion, Mr. Premier.
The suggestion of prorationing of natural gas has been one that the government has asked the Conservation Board to look at. Well, I can remember back in 1975 to 79 that being considered several times. And it is something that the Conservation Board looks at continually. But it's quite, back in the years 75 to 79, upon looking at it and talking to industry about it, they recommended to us that it not be considered. That was also a time in which there was surplus gas, well shut in, and only certain companies had a share of the market. Because of the long-term nature of the contracts, they felt then there were companies who had debentures, for instance, 20-year debentures tied into gas sales contracts, and that it would be dramatically changing the rules on those companies and probably causing them to default on some of their debentures, things like that. That the recommendation was that natural gas did not fit prorationing. As members know, that oil is sold on a month-to-month basis, and prorationing fits there because it isn't a long-term contract. However, I understand the point that the member for Westlock Sturgeon is trying to make, and it would be something from time to time, as I said, that the Conservation Board would consider and report to the government on.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier. I'm glad you are, because I think it's constructive and times have changed. But in view of the Premier and the Minister of Energy's failure to get the PGRT returned to Alberta, would you at least approach the Prime Minister to see whether or not the revenue raised from the PGRT could be used to help the Western oil producers?
As I said in my estimates the other day, Mr. Speaker, it is necessary to remove the PGRT because it doesn't make much sense to be trying to develop other assistance programs to our industry, our energy industry, at the same time that money is being taken from them. It really doesn't make sense to have that tax in place and still trying to help them while you're hurting them with the other hand. And I think it's far more appropriate to try and have the tax removed and then develop the programs. that would help. The point made by the member for Westlock Sturgeon that somehow we would allow them to tax the money and then flow it back in some way sort of balances off an unfair tax, but I think by far the preferable way would be to remove the tax altogether. In that regard, I've talked about energy matters along those lines this morning with the Prime Minister, as a matter of fact, and we are meeting with the MPs on Thursday, and we will be able to report to them, I think, in a very positive manner that we now have both the Liberals and the NDP supporting us in this regard. And while it is a reversal, it's a nice change.
Final supplementary. I agree it doesn't make sense, but it still makes more sense than the whole Western Accord did. But I'd like to ask the Premier, final supplementary, has any representative of the federal government told the Premier that they would not consider taking off the PGRT unless Alberta government puts in a sales tax?
No, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary member for Calgary Forest Lawn.
To the Premier, Mr. Speaker, how does the Premier intend to restore investor confidence after having threatened to cut off gas exports?
Mr. Speaker, it was interesting that in discussing the responsibilities that the government have in terms of our leases and our legislation to prevent waste of a resource, that some have managed to construe that as cutting off supplies to the east, turning off the taps and things like that. And I don't think anybody who is sitting in the House, perhaps other than the odd person in the gallery, could have drawn that inference out of my comments. And we will continue to fulfill that responsibility. And anybody who wants to participate in the oil and gas industry in Alberta realizes that responsibility is there. And if someone was coming merely to somehow scrounge natural gas at a cheap, wasteful price that we would be forced to not allow happen, well then they aren't the people we want in the industry. But if people are seriously wanting to participate in Alberta's oil and gas industry, all the incentives are there. And we have had over the years reports from the United States, Great Britain, Australia, Japan, that this is a tremendous place to invest in the oil and gas industry. It's a tremendous place because of the solid policies that make it such a good spot for investing, and of course many Albertans as well as other Canadians along with those from other countries have made a very good living, have built fortunes, have built companies, and that's going to happen in the future.
Member for Banff Cochrane, followed by the member for Edmonton Avonmore.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Tourism, and it relates to the Canada-Alberta Tourism Agreement that was entered into last summer. I understand that his department began accepting applications in November. Could the Minister update the House as to the progress of the program and what uptake, if any, there has been with respect to applications since November?
Mr. Speaker, the response has been very positive to this point, coming from tourism operators, from associations and municipalities. And we've sent out some 3,000 plus information kits all across the province. And a number of applications were approved back in May by the federal minister responsible and myself. And we have another group of them just about ready now to be announced publicly.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister, given the Minister's answer, has he, with or without his federal counterpart, considered concerns that have been raised with respect to the complexity of the applications and whether or not he has given consideration to having these applications or the process itself streamlined, given the 3,000 applications that have been received to date?
Mr. Speaker, I am very conscious about application forms. No one likes them particularly, and we want to keep them as simple and as concise as possible and still get the minimum amount of information we need to process the applications. I have received no complaints whatsoever about the application forms. I'm always open to suggestions on how we might improve them, but there has, I said, been no complaints at this point. And the turnaround time is one area that we're trying to improve on. Our target is about 60 days for a turnaround time after receiving a complete application, and it's running about 75 days now, and we'd still like to get that back to a target date of about 60 days.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate my constituents will appreciate the minister's response. Some additional concerns have been brought to my attention, Mr. Speaker, and the concerns are that the applicant must be required to spend a disproportionate amount of the grant on consultant study rather than on the project itself. Could the minister clarify whether this is required or not?
Mr. Speaker, the federal-provincial agreement makes allowance for feasibility studies, but they're not mandatory. A company or an association that wishes to move forward may apply for a feasibility study and use that. They may wish to use their own in-house. Most of them do that in order to qualify for the application process. But certainly I would be as disturbed as the honourable member or anyone that if a disproportionate amount was used on feasibility studies.
Final supplementary, Mr. Speaker. There is some concern among smaller operators, Mr. Speaker, that the financial assistance is available only to the larger operators in the province. A case in point is the nearly $500,000 grant to the Banff Springs Hotel. My question to the minister, are small to medium-sized operators having any success in accessing this program?
Mr. Speaker, certainly you don't have to be a major operation to receive funding under this agreement. And the major criteria that is established to allow for funding is whether or not the project will appeal to national and international visitors, and whether it would do something to enhance or target an increase in international visitors. And the honourable member for Banff Cochrane also has some others in his area, as well as many other members do, which are very small operations, and I personally feel that they are the ones that should receive the greatest amount of consideration.
Member for Westmont Sturgeon.
To the minister, Mr. Speaker, could he give us what the smallest grant has been that has been approved, just to lay this rumor to rest?
It's an excellent question. I'd have to go back over it. I recall there was one at Pritis for some $26,000. There's some down, I believe, even lower than that, but I'd have to go back over the number of ones that have been approved and the ones that have come in. I think many times we have to, whatever the project is that will enhance national and international visitors, it certainly shouldn't have to be a large sum of money to qualify. I think the small mama and papa operators in this province are the ones that we want to see succeed.
Member for Edmonton Avonmore, followed by the member for Edmonton Meadowlark.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Social Services was not here last Friday when questions were asked about a September 1985 memo from her Deputy Minister, Mr. Zurkovich. Does the minister now intend to revoke the supplementary guidelines which treat social service employees so paternalistically, particularly regarding membership in groups?
Mr. Speaker, the memorandum in question is under discussion by a special working committee in the department, which includes union members.
Mr. Speaker, what possible reasons can the minister have to support keeping in any way, shape or form these very restrictive guidelines in the atmosphere of fear that they create?
Mr. Speaker, as I have been given to understand, the guidelines were created last year in an endeavour to make sure that employees understood possible conflict of interest situations. But, Mr. Speaker, I would say once again that those guidelines are a subject of discussion by a working committee.
Mr. Speaker, in the past few days we've seen several examples of the minister's department being out of control. Will the minister indicate what action she has taken to make certain all departmental bureaucrats are communicating official departmental policy only?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure how often I have to say it, but the particular memo that the honourable member is referring to is a matter of discussion between management and union employees.
Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, I'm concerned this department may not be the only one with supplementary unconstitutional guidelines. The Premier is no doubt reviewing this situation in all departments. Would he indicate how widespread such situations are and explain procedures he will be introducing to assure that deputy ministers and other bureaucrats are not arbitrarily dictating to employees in such dangerous ways?
Next, please.
Mr. Speaker, it was true that after the charter was declared, that the government had, under the, I think it was the leadership of the Attorney General's Department, total review of all legislation to make sure that it was in some, yeah, I know, let me finish. Now, who needs, In any event, Mr. Speaker, I thought, since I didn't mention this last week, that I should confirm for the House that all of the legislation was reviewed to make sure it was not in conflict with the Charter. Now, such matters as the member raised with the Minister of Social Services today and was raised last week are things that are constantly reviewed, and the one, as the Minister of Social Services has said, is now being reviewed by a group involving the union, and that review, I'm sure, will lead to the type of code that would best meet the needs of both the people of Alberta, represented by their government, and the employees. And we have a high level of efficiency, capability in the public service in this province, of which we're all very proud, and I'm sure that all of the deputy ministers and others are constantly reviewing these matters to make sure that their relationships with their employees are handled in the best way possible.
May I just supplement the Honourable Premier's answer, because I believe it's obvious that the opposition has not delved into a number of matters very thoroughly, otherwise the matter might have been raised quite differently. The Joint Consultation Committee, to which I referred in the terms of reference which I filed in the Assembly today, was established pursuant to a collective agreement. And, Mr. Speaker, that joint committee had raised with it some concerns about the memorandum in question last fall. It was the subject of discussion at a November meeting, at which time there was an undertaking made by the union representatives to come back with the specifics of their choice of wording and so on to be made available to the Deputy Minister. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, the members have not yet been able to file or to bring forward that information. And this committee, Mr. Speaker, will deal with many matters that obviously should be resolved when questions are raised by the membership, by employees, that they are concerned about. I'm very pleased that we have such a committee. And, Mr. Speaker, for the honourable member to be intervening in an undertaking by the union people is absolutely deplorable.
Concerns I wonder if honourable members would care to adjourn to the lounge and have a cup of coffee and carry on the discussion. Part of the difficulty of long answers is also the matter of long questions, and some which are very argumentative. There's room for a final supplementary by the member for Edmonton Avonmore. It's very brief.
I'm wondering if the minister would not indicate, and I realize that she's responsible.
Would you ask the question, please?
True that the minister was a charter member of the Human Rights Commission.
Matter of public record.
Member for Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, this is to the Premier. will he take his minister out to the woodshed and talk to her that this is a matter of principle, not an administration, a matter of principle, and surely it doesn't have to be reviewed. He knows the difference between right and wrong on this issue.
The chair hesitates to interject once again, but perhaps the chair and the member for Westlock Sturgeon could adjourn to the woodshed. That's the fourth time this afternoon that the member has referred to you instead of dealing with the impersonal form. I put the form of correction in the data, please. Member for Edmonton Gold Bar, followed by the member for Edmonton Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Social Services. The newly defined poverty line set by the National Council of Welfare place an Edmonton family of 4 on social assistance at $6,619 below the poverty line. Will the minister be increasing basic social allowance rates in the light of these disturbing figures?
Mr. Speaker, the social allowances are calculated based on basic costs of what we believe to be the fundamentals, food, clothing, and shelter. And of course, there are a number of other allowances besides, and not calculated in that are the monetary worth of medical and other associated areas that are covered. And so in looking at costs, Mr. Speaker, we do not develop social allowance on the basis of its relativity to incomes across Canada.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the minister, does the minister believe that by distributing 5,000 manuals from the Edmonton Social Planning Council, that will in fact be effective in informing and re-informing social assistance applicants of their entitlements?
Mr. Speaker, as a result of efforts made with the 2 major food banks in the province, in Edmonton and Calgary, in looking at some of the problem areas with respect to those who were accessing food banks, one of the major causes was judged to be a lack of information in what services were available from social services, especially in the emergency area. And because the manual that the honourable member has just spoken about was a very good manual, we believe that that was one of the most important things that could be distributed because, in fact, there was judged to be a lack of information.
Mr. Speaker, 5,000 will hardly do the trick. Will the minister at least discontinue the draconian practice of deducting utility debts and other payments for much-needed food, clothing, and household personal allowances, the system of recoveries?
Mr. Speaker, that is always a very difficult area where it has come to light that an overpayment or other circumstances have prevailed where monies have flowed and they should not have. And in instances where there is extreme hardship, it's not always possible, obviously, to collect, and those circumstances have to then be judged on an individual basis.
To the minister, so it comes off what's already been assigned as the absolute minimum they need to survive on. Will the minister explain to the House why social assistance support payments for children are substantially less than support payments for children in foster care? The 1985 rates put a boy of 10 at $140 on social allowance. Same boy of 10 in foster care gets $311.
Mr. Speaker, there are a number of things that enter into any foster care arrangement. Obviously, those foster parents who take on this responsibility don't necessarily plan for that ahead of time, and there would be a portion of their home used for foster care that wouldn't normally be needed had they not taken on the foster care responsibility. And so when we take a look at what's allowed, for instance, in the shelter area for a family, that is judged on the size of the family, and obviously it would differ depending on the size of the family.
Supplementary question to the Minister. There seems to be some discrepancy in terms of the amount of money allocated to meet basic needs. And I'm wondering if her department is initiating any type of comprehensive cost of living study to be done to determine how much money people should be getting to meet those basic needs.
Mr. Speaker, I think it is well known how the figures are arrived at with respect to the three basic areas that are allowed for in social allowance. And those areas have been used, the same calculations have been used for some period of time, and percentages added depending on the types of figures that come in with relation to food, clothing, and shelter. And so the areas of shelter allowance, for instance, have changed over time. If that area were to go up, there would be a change in the marketplace, then obviously that particular area would be raised. And Mr. Speaker, in the discussions that are ongoing with the two major food banks, the precise amount that is being allocated to social recipients, the social allowance recipients, has not been a matter of any kind of discussion that I am aware. There is more a concern about the information as to precisely what's available being made known in the public so that people can access it. And the actual amounts have not been called into question.
Member for Edmonton Kingsway.
Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Treasurer. Last week, I raised some questions in this House about the late filing of Northwest Trust's financial statements and the amount of public money which has been sunk into supporting this company and its direct corporate associates. Has the Provincial Treasurer instructed his officials to tabulate the total value of public support packages which have gone to date into this trust company and its horizontally integrated associates through the Treasury branches?
Mr. Speaker, the member did raise that question last week, and I believe at that time I indicated to him that in matters of commercial transactions between the Treasury branch and Treasury branch clients, that of course I must maintain the confidentiality of those transactions. I know that there have been certain media speculations about the size of the Treasury branch investment, but I can only underscore the point that those are in fact speculations.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. Can the Treasurer assure the Assembly that as much as 15 to 20% of the Treasury branch loans portfolio is not tied up in the Northwest group of companies?
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, of course, it would be difficult for me to deal with those kinds of data, since, in fact, I am not sure just what form or, in fact, size the Treasury branch may have with any particular client. It is for the Treasury branch themselves to decide the merits of investment, and they alone make that decision.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. It's a matter of public record that it's somewhere between $600 and $700 million, and that the 1985 annual statement says that the Treasury branch has assets of $6.2 billion. That's around 15%. The public has the right to know whether that is the commitment or not the commitment of this government to the taxpayers' dollars, with the taxpayers' dollars to this company.
Mr. Speaker, there's no question the Treasury branch has been one of the key successes of this government in the last 10 years, and we'll continue to use the Treasury branch to sustain the capital markets, provide needed assistance to small business to expand the size of the loans outstanding. As a matter of fact, the Treasury branches are the 20th largest financial institution in this country. It's a marked success, and I appreciate the efforts undertaken by the Treasury branches.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. Is the minister trying to say that he will sit by and let the Treasury branch go down the tube with Northwest Trust?
That's absolutely misleading, Mr. Speaker, and I suggest you withdraw that.
That's right. Honourable member for Edmonton Kingsway.
That was the final supplementary, I believe.
The honourable minister is asked about withdrawing with respect to the comments as made. Okay.
I'm supposed to withdraw what? If he is going to sit by and watch the Treasury branches go down the tube with Northwest Trust.
This will become a matter for some perusal of the blues. The time for question period has expired. There. Orders of the day. Orders of the day.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to seek the unanimous consent of the Assembly to waive the normal notice and other requirements of the standing orders so that the following motion may now be put. Be it resolved that the Assembly urge the Government of Alberta to convey